friends, welcome to our study today. This session will be primarily a study of the four biographies of Jesus which open the New Testament, known as the Gospels. The word gospel simply means good news. In ancient Rome, the word was used to announce that a new emperor came to the throne, and it was a call for all the people to come and honor him. So it was no accident that the word would also be used to announce the coming of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and ultimately call all people to bow down and honor him as well. It's important to remember that ancient biographies like these are different than we think of biographies today. Now, they don't claim to be telling every detail of Jesus' life in chronological order. Rather, each writer includes the information relevant to their individual themes and target audience. This is why we have four distinct biographies of Jesus. Each one gives the story through a different set of eyes. It's been compared to the various TV networks. ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox report much of the same information, but again, each communicates to a different target audience, and with that in mind, they each all have their own distinct style. One may include details that the other don't, and one may emphasize things that the others don't, but it's still the same story. Now, some ask if the gospel writers may have researched outside material as they compile their gospels, and of course that's a possibility, especially in the case of Luke's gospel. We'll be talking more about that when we get to it. Other books of the Bible openly acknowledge referencing outside sources, especially the historical books of the Old Testament. But the Bible, that doesn't undermine the Bible's inspiration at all. It simply means that God directed the writers to sources where they could get the information they needed. Now, there are some critics who claim that the Gospels were written long after Jesus' life and are not credible sources, but that's nonsense. The fact is, all four Gospels are quoted by early church fathers as early as the 1st and 2nd century, and to have even that would mean that they were all written within one lifetime after Jesus. And for someone to have even one biography written that close to their life is very rare. And the fact that Jesus had four written that close to his life on earth shows the impact that he had on the world. Now, there were other books written and circulated that were also called quote-unquote Gospels. But contrary to what Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code might tell you, the fact that they were included in the Bible was not because of some big conspiracy theory the church had to keep them out. The first century church didn't have the centralized authority to do that even if they wanted to. The fact is that the early Christians were familiar with these books, and they knew that they were forgeries, so that's why they were never seriously considered. The first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the Synoptic Gospels, meaning that they share a similar synopsis or summary of Jesus' life. The fourth Gospel of John does have its own distinctives, but it also plays a very special role in telling Jesus' story, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. First up is the Gospel of Matthew, or Matthew. Now, Matthew, also known as Levi, was one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. He was a tax collector, which means he allowed a lot of enemies even among his own people. You might recall how religious leaders of the day criticized Jesus for being friend with tax collectors. Now, the reason for that was for Jews living under the oppression of the Roman Empire, for one of their own to take a job working for the Roman government was seen as an act of treason against your own people. Matthew's initial encounter came when Jesus approached him and simply said, "Follow me." Now, Matthew later threw a banquet at his house along with some of his tax collector friends for Jesus, and again, that raised the eyebrows of the religious crowd. Why would the Messiah associate with these kind of people? Matthew's Gospel is 28 chapters long, and it places great emphasis on Jesus being the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. In fact, it quotes from the Old Testament more than the other three Gospels combined. History tells us that Matthew went on to spend time ministering in the region of Judea and then moving on to Ethiopia, where, like all but one of the original apostles, he wound up dying a martyr's death, being killed with a sword. Mark, also known as John Mark, was not an apostle, but he was one of the earliest Christian missionaries. He worked closely with the apostle Peter, and no doubt learned a lot of what he knew from him. He's widely believed to be the young man who ran away naked when Jesus was being arrested. Now, Mark's Gospel is considered to be the oldest of the four, and it's also the shortest and most direct. More emphasis is placed on Jesus' actions than his teachings. And that's not surprising, since we mentioned before it was geared toward a Roman audience, and it's understandable that the emphasis on Jesus' miracles would be there to show where the real power is. The book of Acts tells us that Mark went on to assist Paul and Silas on their first missionary journey, but for some unknown reason, Mark abandoned the journey, and that led to a serious rift with Paul. But in the final letter before his death, 2 Timothy, Paul would recommend Mark to assist Timothy in his ministry, so apparently they had made amends. And eventually Mark was also martyred in the city of Alexandria, being dragged to death by horses. Next we have Luke. Luke was also not one of the original 12 disciples. He was a physician by trade, which would indicate that he was an educated man, a man of science. He was either a Gentile or a Jew who had adapted to Greek culture, as some of them had at the time. But if he was a Gentile, then that would give him the distinction of being the only non-Jewish writer in the entire Bible. Luke's gospel is 24 chapters long, and it's the most detailed of the four. Even secular scholars consider Luke to be a first-rate historian. We see the basis for his biography in the introduction in chapter 1, starting with verse 1 through 4. Many people have set out to write accounts of the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I have decided to write a careful account to you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you've been taught. So Luke says up front that he carefully researched the material, and also notice the reference to a person known as Theophilus. In other ancient literature, that was the author's way of acknowledging a benefactor, someone who sponsored their work. So it may have been that this Theophilus was a wealthy Gentile convert to Christianity who wanted to know more about his faith and commissioned Luke to do the research for him. Now Luke would go on to spend the rest of his life in missionary work. Being a physician, he was probably one of the early medical missionaries. He worked closely with the Apostle Paul, and the second letter to Timothy, which again was written just before Paul's death, Paul indicates that only Luke was still with him after all his other friends and co-workers had deserted him. And Luke was later hanged in Greece, also dying a martyr's death. Finally, we have the Gospel of Yohanan, or John the Beloved, who was Jesus' closest friend on the earth. John was a commercial fisherman working for the family business along with his brother James and his father Zebedee, as well as Peter. Jesus had nicknamed him the Son of Thunder because of his violent temper, but that did mellow over time as he matured in his faith. And throughout the Gospel, he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. We see him along with Peter and James in some of the most intimate moments in Jesus' life, most notably at the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus went to pray before he was crucified. Also, as Jesus was dying, he entrusted him to care for his mother Mary, which indicates the deep level of friendship and trust he had with John. John's Gospel contains 21 chapters, and there are some who criticize it because it was written much later than the Synoptic Gospels, and because it contains a great deal of material that the others don't. But the reasons for that are easily explained. First, John was the only one of the 12 original disciples who did not die a martyr's death. He actually lived to quite an advanced age and wrote the Gospel toward the end of his life as a recollection of his relationship with Jesus. And in being written at the later date, it presupposes that the reader has some familiarity with the other Gospels, so really rehashing the same information is not necessary. Now, although he wasn't martyred like the other disciples, John did suffer tremendously for his faith. He was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he experienced the visions that we now read in the magnificent book known as Revelation. Later, he was released from Patmos and settled in the city of Ephesus, and he became a prominent leader in the church there. And for the rest of his life, his ministry to believers was simply, little children, love one another. While these 4 books are the primary sources of information for the life of Jesus we're talking about in our study, his presence is found throughout the entire Bible. In the next lesson, we'll be talking about what he did before he came to earth, what a lot of people don't think about, and also the amazing prophecies that prepared the way for his coming. So we ask that you subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, like us, and leave any comments you might have. In the meantime, keep it real. Thank you for joining us.